I also want to kind of tag it or pin it to what you said about Philadelphia being a city of underdogs, because I have heard that often and I've seen it play out in certain things. Like I remember reading an article once about how Philadelphia's exported art all have to do with people who lose. Like the movie Rocky, for example, like he loses at the end. We had a horse, Smarty Jones, that was characterized by how much he lost at the time. And I think that and I also heard Philadelphia referred to as a second city for the first time in my life a few weeks ago, which I had never heard. And I don't necessarily agree that it's a second city. I think it's very much its own thing. Growing up there, what did I know? I didn't know anything about any other city or town or any other way of living when I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, like Adina does in the book. So to me, the whole world was, very shoddy zoning regulations that allowed a miniature golf course next to a strip mall, next to a real estate office, next to a playground. And I was, yeah, I was intimidated by a lot. I can hear members of my family saying, "You weren't shy growing up," because I think I was different in the home. I think that with my brothers, I grew up around boys, um, with brothers, and I don't think that they would agree with the estimation of me as shy. But I was the youngest, I was the baby, and I was the only girl. And I felt that I was unable to kind of relate in the way it seemed that other kids were able to relate when they were in school. And so learning and school and teachers became my refuge. School was very much a place where I felt like as hard as I worked was met with the same kind of reward. And I think that that is why in Beautyland, school is such a big part of Adina's life. Literally, Celestial School, which is called the night classroom in Beautyland, where her superiors kind of teach her things way beyond her ken as a little girl growing up, and in her actual school, where the teachers actually see her and her uniqueness and her weirdness isn't treated as something other than cool and singular. And I very much had that experience too.
Okay, so we should probably right now, for listeners who haven't had a chance to read the novel, orient them a little bit in terms of the basic conceit of the book. You talked about Adina and the night classroom and her ordinary life. Like people are probably sitting at home wondering what you mean. So can you just give like a broad strokes overview of who Adina is and what the conceit of your novel is?
Of course. And I hope it's not the I hope it's the only time that readers at home are like, "What is she talking about?" Beautyland is a is the story about of a lifespan of a woman who believes that she is not from Earth, and she communicates with what she calls her superiors on a planet called Planet Cricket Rice through via fax machine that her mother drags out of the trash one day in her youth. And she spends her life notating on human beings, which she considers to be her job. And so Adina Giorno is very much a reporter, a journalist, a writer figure, and that separates her from most of her peers for most of her life.
Planet Cricket Rice.
That's the closest human equivalent to the closest English equivalent to her planet's true name.
Okay. And so I'm wondering, first of all, if you feel like as an adult you remain shy, or if that's something that you sort of associate with your youth.
Well, like many shy kids, I found theater first of all when I was 13. So like many shy kids, I found theater, which allowed me to come out of my shell and find solace with other people once I got out of my shell. And I also compensated for being shy by being extroverted at times. And so even though I was nervous and intimidated by adults mostly when I was growing up, I desperately longed to be part of the world. And I longed to see other places. And I had a pretty profound curiosity about how other people lived. Not nosiness, I was just really curious how everyone was doing this wild thing called living and life. And so I was able to bridge the gap between what I felt like was my inability to be loud in the world, by this way of being extroverted. And theater and writing and a lot of my extracurricular activities helped me with that.
And in terms of outer space, the sort of fantastical aspect of your fiction that you're becoming known for, I'm wondering if, as a child and as an adult, you have, like, as a kid, did you have a high degree of fascination with outer space? Like, was this something that were you one of those kids who was looking to the sky and really wondering what was out there, with a greater degree of intensity than the average kid?
I'm embarrassed to say that no, I really didn't. Did you? Were you one of those kids?
No, I wasn't. I think maybe as an adult, I've become more that way.
Mm-hmm.
I went through a really intense period during the pandemic, maybe, where I was like thinking about aliens a lot.
Uh-huh.
and
Well, a
and
lot of people
it's
are.
yeah, it's been in the news. And by the way, I'm curious now as I say that to understand what the psychological connection is between the pandemic and me, like wanting to escape the earth,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or be taken away somehow. But I, uh, I couldn't help but wonder, because you are writing in this mode. And I was also wondering if Adina as a character and this novel as a whole was originated in a short story. I think I have that right. Was it the
Mm-hmm.
short story, Sometimes You Break Their Hearts, Sometimes They Break Yours? Is that a correct read?
Yes, it is. That's exactly
Okay.
right. Mm-hmm.
I like hearing that. I think that's a relatively common thing for writers to go through, where they write a novel that had its origins in a shorter piece of work. Can you talk about that life cycle and like where Adina and this kind of ambiguous, I call her an ambiguous alien, because the way that
Mm-hmm.
you just characterize it is we're not entirely certain if
Mm-hmm.
this is an alien or some kid who feels like one. But you just talk
Right.
about the creative origin story.
Or both, right? Alien and a kid who feels like one, or a little of both. Yeah. Sure. Sometimes You Break Their Hearts was in my first collection and was directly derived by my almost lifelong observation that customs, rituals, opinions, laws that we have in the human world are just downright ridiculous sometimes. How our body works and what we how we behave in public and what our social customs are, and of course that varies from country to country and in different religions, are just downright silly if you take out the objective understanding of them. So, for example, things like the fact that we secrete water from our eyes when we are sad or in love or frustrated, or happy, is just so funny when you take out the human understanding of it. And so I began to keep a folder of those things on my desktop, and it's called Notes on Human Beings. And after I wrote that story and it was published, I noticed that the person at the helm of that story wouldn't let me go. And nor could I stop taking notes on human beings. And the folder kept growing and growing and growing. And then around the edges of the observation, this character started glimmering through the tapestry of all of those notes. And I thought, I wonder if this could be a novel. But for it to be a novel, as I found out, I not only had to have the semblance of a character, I had to have the whole, physical location and name of the character. I had to have backstory and family, and I had to build her out. And that became the project of bringing the story into the novel. The other thing is that the story is written in first person, and I found, and with a very voicey, like the showcase of that story is voice. She's really, really funny. she but she's not very well developed because she doesn't have to be in a 10-page story. For the novel, she had to have layered depth underneath these observations. So the first person, unfortunately, I tried it. That voice didn't sustain itself over the course of 300 pages. And so I had to retype the novel when I was finished the first few drafts from first person into third person. In fact, I went to a writing residency thinking that I was about to finish the novel. It wasn't necessarily a residency. My friend Amy Brill, another fiction writer who is lovely, and one of my friends, and I went to her house for like a weekend of writing. And I found as soon as I got there that the novel was in the wrong voice. So not only was it not finished, about to be finished, it had to be completely retyped. And I also knew that I would need more than 3 or 4 days to do that or even start that, because I needed the kind of momentum that I knew it would take me months to do it correctly. So Amy was typing along for the 4 days and having like this beautifully productive, gorgeous, like summer long weekend. And I was just kind of stymied, staring at the wall, reading trashy magazines, honestly, because I knew, I'm like, I need more than this weekend will allow. So then I went home and I started changing the novel to third person. And as soon as I did, what happens when the craft decision is correct, I've found, is that coincidences and magic begins to occur. And as soon as I changed the voice, I mean, within pages, other things began to come through the narrative. Her mother became really important. The people in her neighborhood became important. The neighborhood became important. And somehow backing away from the intimacy of her voice allowed me this buffering distance that enabled the world to come through a little more. And it was just magic. And I knew I had it. It was just one of those great, great moments that you hope for as a fiction writer.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that when the craft decision is right, the magic starts happening. It sort of feels like every book has its way of being, or every story has its way of being told. And until you find that way, it's going to resist you.
Mm-hmm.
And this observational distance that you just described, where you backed away from the intimacy of being inside of Adina's head and, writing the story through her voice, is related in my mind to the notion that Beautyland is such a deft book at the level of human observation, and yet there is an extraterrestrial, or a possible extraterrestrial, at the heart of the book. And it reminded me as well, because this is also a funny book, and we haven't mentioned that yet, but people should know that these observations, they have like a distinct ring of truth. And sometimes it's like, what did Muhammad Ali used to say? Like, what is it, like, humor is the truth but faster, or something like that. Like, that's kind of how the humor operates in this novel for me, is that she'll make these really plain spoken observations and be sending them back to the mothership or to Planet Cricket Rice or whatever, and they just make you go, oh yeah, that really is how it is with people. We really do secrete water out of our eyes when we're happy and sad, and people really do tend to not like it when other human beings are happy. Like, some of the observations are sort of sad. There's a kind of heartbreaking quality to them. But all of which is to say, that's interesting that you could be so sharp in observations about humans while writing about an extraterrestrial. It made me kind of think of Kurt Vonnegut in a way, because there's like an extraterrestrial POV, or what I would call a celestial POV, where you're kind of like looking down on the planet and observing
Right.
the species. That's the feel that I had.
Right. Which is why the
And
third person was necessary too, because she's reporting on humans, but she's also desperately hoping that someone is looking down on her and that she will one day be collected either on Earth or beyond. Did Muhammad Ali say that? That is really funny. I attribute a quote that's similar to that to George Saunders, who said, humor is being told the truth faster and more directly than we're used to, which I've
you know
always really
what?
liked.
I have one of these memories that is suspect.
So do
uh,
I.
it's just a jumble. I'm pretty sure it was Muhammad Ali, and then probably George Saunders was paraphrasing him, and probably Muhammad Ali was paraphrasing someone. But I could be misremembering, and maybe it was George Saunders. So we'll give both of them credit. How does that sound?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everyone's paraphrasing everyone else anyway. But
That's
yes,
right.
it's interesting to hear you say, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's funny that she's observing life so acutely and so well, hopefully, thank you. Um, and she's an extraterrestrial, because I actually believe the reason she is able to observe them so well is because she is extra to the terrain, because she is an other, because she is not of them, so to speak. That buffering distance I was talking about is also the distance that is sometimes necessary to really truly see something. So as a writer, unfortunately, sometimes, but fortunately, most times, I feel like I have to be apart from society and human beings to really see, and apart from experiences I've had. Some time has had to go by. It literally, I had to move away from Philadelphia and be 2 hours north on the turnpike before I was kind of able to turn back around and see Philadelphia and see my experiences there as something that even warranted writing about. And so this distance isn't, I find it to be absolutely crucial and necessary. And that is baked into the metaphor that's at the heart of Beautyland. That makes the equation possible. Adina is able to see how bananas human beings are about things like fried eggs on everything, and how, like, the song Amazing Grace seems to be one of the only things that crosses cultural and religious lines, and that gives people hope, because she is, quote unquote, alien to the world.
Well, I feel like, it has a POV matter and a human matter.
Mm-hmm.
Getting that kind of distance and sort of forcing yourself to view human behavior through that lens is a useful exercise. Not only does it lead to a good novel, but it also could just lead to like new perspective, like
Oh, yeah.
something about that, like looking from above or looking through the eyes of a total other, somebody who would be naturally confused by what's going on
Oh,
around
yeah.
her. It's fun to read. It's fun to read. It
Oh, I'm
makes the
glad.
reader by proxy have to reevaluate these things that we otherwise take for granted in our day to day. Right? We just go through
Yeah.
life and we just accept at face value that everybody's sort of like moved by amazing grace, and people tend to respond poorly when they're in the presence of somebody who's super happy, and all
Yeah,
this kind of
right.
stuff.
Exactly. If I do nothing else, Brad, I hope to make the familiar very, very strange. So that, like, sometimes in interviews, I'm asked, what do you hope the reader takes from the book? And I never know how to answer. And normally I'm like, I have no idea. Maybe some positive feeling, that would be nice. But for this book, I have a really distinct answer, that what I hope a reader takes is that it fucks them up a little bit for the next few hours after they put the book down and encounter the world. I hope they encounter it as if for the first time a little bit, to see and notice every single moment of our existence, like the plates we use and the things that we say to one another. Beginner's mind, I think, is a good description of Adina as well. She constantly comes at things with this unfettered understanding, and in that way, she's kind of my hero. You know, many characters I've written have been wishes I've made, and I think that that part of Adina, though a lot of what has happened to her is sourced from my own life, that she constantly keeps this beginner's mind is more of an aspirational craft thing, I think.
Well, I mean, I walked away thinking to myself once again, it's not the first time I've thought this, but this reminded me yet again of how deeply strange life is.
Mm.
Like, it's easy to lose an appreciation for that because we get caught up, right? We get caught up in our conventional reality. But this book does make you press pause and you go, oh, yeah, how weird. And I also have to say, and this is just bringing to mind, it's semi related, that I share with Adina in a way that gave me great affection for her, a disdain for loud chewing noises, like mouth noises.
Aha.
So I was, and so for people listening, Adina is sensitive to sound. And so people eating popcorn in the movies, for example, drives her crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Count me among the aliens who are the same way. Are you this way?
Yes. So do
Okay.
you consider yourself to have what is known as misophonia?
I probably do.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think like, I just think that like sound intrusion in the wrong context is rude.
But it's interesting and not surprising that you would have hypersensitivity to sound, considering what you do, and considering that the first 10 minutes of our time together was spent, okay, go to this file, make this sound, turn this noise down, make sure you don't your refrigerator's not running. Do you have a landline? And I mean, it makes sense, but I was also like on it too, because and I'd already thought of a lot of that because I too am very sensitive to sound. Misophonia, which I mean, I don't know if it has been totally legitimized yet or not. I was so supremely happy when I heard that word for the first time, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, is accompanied by rage and is accompanied by a really enhanced reaction of perturbedness to the sound as well. So, and normally, from what I've read, there's one kind of sound in particular. So some people can't stand the sound of phlegm in someone's nose. Some people go berserk if they hear a pen clicking. For me, it is mouth noises and eating noises to the chagrin of everyone I've ever known well. Normally, I like to have some kind of music playing or something, but I've also worked on it so that I can be a non-aggravating person in the world to my loved ones. Is it something that you've worked on, or do you just allow yourself full throttle aggravation,
No,
grumpiness?
I mean I can deal. I can deal. If I have to be at
That's
if I
good.
have to be at a table at somebody's house, I'm not going to like start enforcing rules. But it's
But
just
you want to. I bet
I
you
do.
want
I
to.
think it's objectively gross. I don't see what the
Yeah.
argument is. Like I feel like I'm like I don't see why we're even debating this. It's disgusting to listen to somebody chew loudly, like masticate, including me. It's not like I'm above this. And so I just
Hmm.
think that the whole concept of the quiet meal around the table needs to be reevaluated. I think we've kind of accepted this as status quo, and
Interesting.
I feel
Now,
like we need
Brad, do
music.
you know, are you aware that many people find a quiet meal around a table like a really beautiful, joyful thing that
Yeah,
they
they're
like
wrong.
go they go to great lengths to have these things? Yeah.
Listen. I
Humans are
went
wild,
on.
right? Yeah.
Humans are wild.
Hmm.
I want to talk as well in a related way about her, uh, the issue of her name.
Hmm.
And I believe it is taken or inspired by Adina Talve Goodman. I hope I'm
Hmm.
pronouncing that right. But can you just talk about who she was and how she informed creative choices in your book, especially
Oh,
around the
absolutely.
Adina's name?
Absolutely. So Adina Talby Goodman was a dear, dear friend of mine. We met in New York, and she she was born with a single ventricle heart and had been waiting for a heart transplant for most of her life, and had one when she was 19 or 20. And when I met her, she was well and was enjoying, being this like wonderful, beautiful time in her life when she was super well. And we became really close. We talked about writing all the time. We would have dinners in New York where we would discuss, she ended up writing nonfiction and going to University of Iowa's program for nonfiction, which she hadn't planned. But she was going to write about her health troubles. And she was just someone she was a dear friend who everyone knew was special and lovely and wonderful, while she was alive, which makes me very happy now, because she passed away when she was 31, and of cancer that was related to the medicine that she was on that kept her heart strong. And so, just knowing her helped me as a human. She was just someone who was naturally in perspective all the time, just knew what was important and what wasn't, and was joyful and a dancer. And she was super funny. And one of the last significant hangs we had, we went to the Brooklyn Historical Society and watched the movie Moonstruck that they were showing. And we walked around with my partner, Ted, after the movie and pretended to kick cans down the street like Cher did in that movie. Like, she was just goofy and wonderful, and made me a better person. And when I got married, my partner and I had our vows. Part of our vows were that we wanted our first texts to each other read in front of our friends and family. And so we had to decide like who would read for each other. And my partner chose his best friend, and I chose Adina because she just had this vivaciousness, and I knew that if I could choose anyone to stand in for me, it would be her. And then we lost her shortly, a couple years after I got married. And long story short, when it came time to name this very special character, I thought in tribute to Adina, I could have her kind of stand in for me again, because though it's her name, it's based more directly on my life than anything else that I've ever written. And so it was kind of me asking her to stand in for me again. And Giorno, her last name, which no one has asked me about yet, is actually
the characters, the alien or the ambiguous alien character is Adina Giorno.
Yes, correct. Her last name is Giorno, which means day, like buongiorno, is after the poet John Giorno, who passed away a couple years ago. And he was a huge figure in art in New York City's poetry and art communities. And I would hear him read every New Year's Day at the Poetry Project's marathon. It was like an all-day poetry marathon. And my favorite part would be when John Giorno would get up there and read, one of the best readers of his own work that I've ever seen. And though I never met him, he made me proud to be Italian. He was like super gay and super fabulous and a wonderful performer. And I privately considered him to be kind of like an artistic grandfather to me, the grandfather I always would have wanted. So that's where Adina Giorno gets her name, from those two beloved people in my life.
And the neighborhood in Philly where you were raised and where Adina is raised are Italian, like pretty heavily Italian American. Is that correct?
It definitely has a big Italian American community. It has a lot of different communities, but that's one of them. And that's where I was raised. I was raised alongside a very thriving Irish American community as well, which is, kind of common in the northeastern cities. And so when my grandparents came to the country, both from Italy and from the Basque region in France. They settled in Philadelphia, and a lot of their friends were the Irish.
And Adina is raised by a single mother. And
Mm-hmm.
this character, her name's Therese. Is that right? Therese?
Therese.
Therese, sorry. And
Mm-hmm.
she works with people who are disabled. She works in a facility that helps people with disabilities. And I know
Mm-hmm.
from poking around that this is drawn from some real life stuff. Your
Mm-hmm.
mother, you were raised by a single mom, and she worked with people who had severe mental disabilities. So here again, I have a child with disabilities. So I was like, I like this mother in real life. I like this mother on the page
Yeah.
because it's
Yeah.
tough work. That is tough work. People who do that work really are saintly, in my view. Like, I don't think the average person probably spends enough time thinking about it or has enough contact. But to work with people who are disabled it's a good thing to do, but it's a very difficult thing to do, especially over the long haul. And I want to say your mom did it for 37 years and did not take a single sick day. Is this right?
Oh, yes. Yes, that is correct. So, and my mom's name is Helene Therese. And so the mother in Beautyland took her name from my mother's name as well. Um, and I also don't, in addition to everything you just said, I also don't read it a lot in fiction. I don't read characters who are working with that population. And I want to say I'm not an expert at the population that my mother worked with, but I would describe them as severe disabilities, so nonverbal, um, people who are not able to live on their own. Back when I was growing up, her facility was called a school, and then it changed to facility, and the nomenclature around working with severe disability has changed a lot since the 80s and 90s as well, and I wanted to reflect that in the book, in addition to things that my mom would come home and tell me. She worked in health services for almost 40 years and while she was doing that, she went back to school to get her GED, then her college degree, then her master's in education, so that when she was 71, instead of retiring from health services, she actually switched careers and began teaching kindergarten, which is what she had always wanted to do her whole life. So my mom is a figure of tremendous strength. And also, it was really hard to grow up with someone who was just like, never take any sick days and never call out and always, operate from the most altruistic side of your heart and benevolence. And it was a very high bar in many ways. And
I was
I
going to
didn't,
say,
oh yeah. Oh my gosh, Brad. Yeah. There was a lot of it wasn't hard to rebel. I'll say that, because literally just calling out from a job was a major rebellion. But I will also say that I didn't want the character to be too angelic. So I muddied up the character in Beautyland of the mom, because if I were to actually write my mother on the page, people would be like, "This woman is just too much. She can't possibly exist," and
right.
she's just so annoyingly, perfect. So I in Adina's childhood, when she's in the fifth grade, her mother participates in an activity. This is how I will say this, that some people would find morally wrong. And I did that deliberately to muddy her up. And it actually, funny enough, this tends to happen. As soon as I had her make that choice, I actually liked her a lot more, because she, in some ways, is really brassy and bold and a really great mother and um, example for Adina. But she also has this part of her that just really wants to be dancing on the lit dance floor of Bob and Barbara's and like drinking with her friends too. She has Adina when she's very young, and her youth ends at that point, And so she still has that girl who wants to be wild and free as well. And so I have never, or I shouldn't say never, but I don't read too many characters who grow in a good way over the course of an entire book. And I wondered, could I do that in a way that I would find interesting? And so the character of the mother became super important and a diagnostic tool for me as well, to see what I was capable of doing in a relatively positive character.
It must have been fun, sort of sullying the mother character,
Oh
giving her a little bit
yeah.
of an edge. That right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's always fun having my characters say things that I would never have the balls to say, or like do things that I would never have the courage to do. Yeah. Oh, it's so fun. I mean, it's just great. And Adina's observations too are an example of that as well, because she's like, for example, there's a diatribe toward the latter part of the book that she goes on about the figure of Yoko Ono and how Yoko Ono represents a deep, deep, deep internalized misogyny. And she's funny about it and she's light about it, but it also reflects something I figured out in my life and kind of became a before and after. I grew up with a lot of music fans, a lot of people who absolutely loved the Beatles. And they would say very freely, Yoko Ono robbed us of 3 more Beatles albums. And I would think, oh, okay, well, Yoko Ono robbed music fans of Beatles albums without even thinking. And then one day you come to find that Yoko Ono is by far like the most brilliant artist and is just like such a wonderful figure in art, and that this was just utter misogyny carving out these almost like understood and acknowledged mottos in the music world that you were allowed to blame Yoko Ono for things. And the day I figured that out, I think I was never ever again going to listen to any like truism regarding a female artist ever again. And it was freeing, and it really like it was amazing to figure out, oh my God, Yoko Ono is the living best. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was happy that
Okay.
I was able to put that in Beautyland.
Yeah, no, I would find myself nodding when I was reading that passage. And I got to say a couple things. I live in Los Angeles, so you see people. I saw her once. It was the most exciting. I think I don't get that excited about seeing people, but I did get excited about seeing her. She had this fabulous hat on. And the second thing I would say is my own sort of narrative with the Beatles and with Yoko. I got to be honest, I never really had a lot of antipathy for her. I wasn't like really invested in that narrative that she destroyed the Beatles. I don't think I like the Beatles enough to care that much, or like to be, that's just not me temperamentally. I don't get that invested in any band like that. But
Mm-hmm.
what I will say though, obviously aware of that narrative, and I have always been a huge John Lennon fan. Like that's my
Mm-hmm.
Beatle if I had to
Mm-hmm.
pick one. But but the John Lennon that I like the most is the John Lennon of the 1970s, where he's doing all that self-investigation and primal
Mm-hmm.
scream therapy, and he's really getting real.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was in high school, that song "God," like I was like, yes, John Lennon. like 15-year-old Brad Listi was deeply into that John Lennon, and what you learn, like as you go along and you maybe read up a little bit and think about it a little bit, is like during that period he was with Yoko, and her influence
Mm-hmm.
upon his art was profound, and it was the
Mm-hmm.
most interesting art in my view that he ever made. So that's what I would add to
Mm.
that.
Man, you
uh,
and Adina are just
I'm saying there's a
absolute
lot of
kindred spirits.
maybe I'm an alien. I think I have suspected this. I could get beamed up at any moment. I don't
I
know,
think
but I
you
feel
are. I think you might be.
so. I want to talk about the title of the book, Beautyland, and I think we've sort of touched upon some of the things that it's alluding to with respect to this sort of cosmic or alien view of ordinary human experience, kind of taking the reader into a deeper appreciation for the strangeness of the world and humanity and the beauty of
Mm-hmm.
it, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's really where you're getting to. Yes, it's strange. Yes, mastication sounds are really annoying, but ultimately there's a lot. Human beings are terribly flawed creatures, but ultimately there's quite a lot of beauty here, right? And there is a beauty to humanity that is worth appreciating. Am I barking up the right tree?
Is that what Adina ends up thinking?
I mean, or just is that kind of thematically resonant with what you were going for or where you were coming to as a writer?
Well, to quote a formative musician in my life, Bob Dylan, I've never experienced beauty without a little bit of pain. And I think that Beautyland as a location, a very, very finite location, both as, this cosmetics place that the mothers in her neighborhood go to, but also the location of her childhood, the location of her whereabouts as she is performing this important assignment on Earth, means, that it's both of those things. That I think that the word beauty, like joy, implies a little bit of pain. And I think that encapsulates two of the broader currents in the book, both of those things. And I think she finds equal parts of both of those things during her lifespan on Earth.
And wait, and Bob Dylan is related to that?
Because I love him and because he's related to everything? No, he said, what I think it's in most of the song, most of the time, behind every beautiful thing, there's been some kind of
some
pain.
kind of pain. Not dark
That's
yet.
What it is.
Yeah,
not dark yet. Oh, thank you.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I would have been so upset if I had gotten that wrong. Behind every beautiful thing, there's been some kind of pain. Yes. There we go.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, yeah, thanks, Bob. And I got to say, here again, I'm totally simpatico with Bob Dylan. I think I just read a tweet the other day. It was like in my timeline, and I found myself like kind of clapping for it. Where they're like, Bob Dylan's underrated, and I was like, yes, like it's a the guy won the Nobel Prize for Literature and has like been celebrated kind of nonstop since he was like 22 years old. So it's a little bit absurd. It's absurd to say that this guy's underrated, but in a way, like in our culture, I would go to the mat saying that he's like so interesting and has remained so vital in his art, so deep into old age. And he's got that kind of cranky edge to him that he has always had. There's something timeless about him. And here's the thing that where I ultimately land on is like, where is there a corollary? Like where there isn't. He's a one-off. Like there is no one in popular music that I can point to who seems like even remotely similar. Like there have been countless iterations of a boy band, right? That stuff happens. Like they come off the assembly line every 5 years, it feels like. Not to denigrate, but just to say. But like somebody who's truly like high art, like combining like high art and real poetry with like folk and all the different American musical idioms and blending them together and making it somehow relevant to mainstream music fans. It's very difficult to do. And I just think that like the achievement that like his achievement in music is pretty singular and maybe underappreciated in modern times. I feel like defending Bob a little bit. I love Bob Dylan.
Do you have a favorite album / favorite song or have you been listening to him recently?
Yeah, I mean, I loved Time Out of Mind. That came out when I was in college, and I would deliver pizzas and listen to that on cassette tape. If that dates me, I'm sorry, but I was big into that album, which is hilarious because I was like 21 and like I was like, not dark yet. It resonated so deeply for me. And then, the older stuff, I mean, Highway 61, that album is great. I like some of like I said, I like those albums of covers that he did. I'm blanking on the names of them because I'm terrible at that. But
you're thinking of Freewheelin' Bob Dylan when he's walking down the street.
Well, no, I'm talking about the album of covers in his later period where he's
the actual album of covers. Oh, I thought you meant the cover. Yeah.
No. I'm thinking of like when he's singing like, Stardust, and he sort of sings these old standards, like these old American standards, but he does it in that, that older, like late period Dylan voice. And they're just lovely. And the orchestrations are really lovely.
Yeah.
But Bringing It All Back Home is another album that I like from his early period. Like he was incredibly prolific over a period of like 4 or 5 years. I think it was, when he kind of he was making like 2 great albums a year. It was crazy. So I don't know, huge fan, and love that you're into him.
Same. Yeah.
And I think too, like I'm always inspired when I see any artist in any medium who is like vital and creative into old age, because that is something to which I aspire. I love it when
Mm-hmm.
like he's never stopped moving. Do you know
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying? Like you can never, he's always a moving target. Like Bob Dylan is never resting on his laurels, it feels like. And I think, you can point to a number of artists who fit this bill. And it seems to be like a characteristic of them is that they never stop staying interested,
Mm-hmm.
and they're always taking stuff in and taking new stuff in. And it's
Right.
not, they don't get stale, I feel like is maybe the formula is to never get so jaded that like you can't get excited about new music or experimentation. And does
Mm-hmm.
that square with how you see it?
That's so interesting. Absolutely, because I think that it kind of bespeaks what art is in their life. So rather than something they do, it's the way that they are. So that it's like a way of seeing and it's a way of moving through the world. And so as long as they are moving through the world, they are doing it. And it's more of a verb for them. And I noticed that a lot of my favorite artists were productive until they died. And he's definitely one of them. I think of bands like the Rolling Stones, um, Lou Reed. I'm just thinking of like the classics and how like they were making art their whole lives because that was synonymous to living for them. And when this comes up in writer circles, I like the fact that writers don't have to retire, because I love the work so much that I hope I'm always expressing myself through the written word. I've always wanted to be a writer since the time I had conscious memory. I was writing and expressing myself through this way, and I hope that it that always happens, and I hope that I'm able to continue to surprise myself and stay open to being changed by other writers and other artists and musicians. And I think that's the best way of doing it.
Along these same lines, in terms of cultural touchstones that are in your book, that I have to believe, based on our conversation, you might share with Adina, Carl
Mm-hmm.
Sagan.
Yes.
He's not an artist per se, but as a scientist, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
he's the closest to an artistic scientist that there is. He was a great writer. I shouldn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
He actually was an artist in his way. Like, I feel like Sagan, as a communicator about the sciences, was super gifted. And
He
Philip
was.
Glass is another one. The music of Philip Glass figures
Yeah.
prominently into this novel, and Adina has a great affection for it, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was a kind of a shrewd choice because there is something otherworldly about his music that I could imagine speaking to someone who feels otherworldly.
Yes, and I also thought that Philip Glass would be good for her to get into after she has her cultural awakening of hip hop in her childhood, um, because he that repetition to me felt mathematic, and I feel like there can be a beautiful relationship between um, math and music, and then math, music, and the galaxy. So I was thinking of in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, how the extraterrestrials in that movie try to communicate with the humans through these tones. I don't know. Have you seen that movie?
It's been a while, but yeah, I'm
It's been a
thinking
while.
back to it now. Yeah.
So there are these tonal sounds that they make, that that is their language, and it's a combination of music and math. And so I had that in my head when I was thinking, okay, what kind of sound? Because Adina's planet is so based on sound and silence and intuition, and what kind of sounds on Earth would bring her solace. And I felt like the comfort of that repetition would would allow her to be at ease. And so Philip Glass was a logical choice for that. And Carl Sagan, I wasn't necessarily super into Carl Sagan, but through researching and thinking through her character. Okay, what would she get into? I was like, oh, Carl Sagan was around. Okay, let me look into Carl Sagan. And then I just, only to find that he was like the coolest,
Right?
hippest
Yes.
astronomer ever, with his little turtlenecks and his like bowl cut, silky bob hair. Oh, loved it. So I watched all his lectures and just, oh man, he taught me a lot
very
too.
prescient human being. Like his
Yeah.
takes on the culture have, I think, largely been proven accurate. Like he kind of foresaw a
Yeah.
lot of the decline that we are currently living through, and
Yep. To
just a
this
very
very
sharp
day.
mind. Yeah. And like, I think it's like, so there's something kind of heartbreaking reading him and thinking about him and just thinking about the dearth of like public intellectuals in our culture.
Right.
He was a
Yeah.
genuine guy who was like on the Tonight Show and was a deep,
Yep.
super brilliant guy. Like we need more of that, please. Like in
Right.
popular culture.
He, unlike me in this interview, was also able to synthesize really complicated ideas into something that could be told to Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. I watched all of those interviews, and in such cool, identifiable ways. I think, like the public astronomers like Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think has a little of that now too. Like he's like the cultural touchstone of astronomy for a large mass of people, which I think is neat. Which is also why I tried to make my science in Beautyland as accurate as is possible when you're writing about an extraterrestrial. Um, my students use the term science fact instead of science fiction. And I was trying to make it super accurate. So if like the Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world came after me, I could at least have a semi leg to stand on. And Carl Sagan's research was what I used most of the time, because he was not only brilliant mathematically, but he had a poet's vision. He was able to imagine things outside the realm and awning of his experience. And he allowed room for what he didn't know, which I think made him like truly a genius. And so Adina and I are really comforted by someone like that, because as she felt in the book, like he never stopped looking for her and he never stopped believing in her. And that's really powerful. And he is a father figure to her. And she didn't have one. And so it was really cool to find Carl Sagan amid all the research.
It's sort of interesting as I'm listening to you to think that like modern American culture anyway seems to have like room for only one of these people. Like the dude who is like the cultural touchstone for astronomy was Carl Sagan, now is Neil deGrasse Tyson. There really can't be two. We just have one. We can only keep track of one. And then I'm thinking of like Diane Fossey was like the gorilla lady. Like then she died and it was like, okay, bring on Jane Goodall. And like, I mean, I don't mean to minimize, but do you know what I'm saying? Like it's not totally untrue. That's kind of crazy to think about.
Only one person can be the gorilla person.
That's it. We don't have room in our cultural conversation for more than one. That's it. So before I let you go, there's something else I want to talk to you about, because I found resonances in like some of the research that I was doing, like interviews that I'd read with you that you have done in the past, where you said the biggest heartbreaks of my life have been losing friends.
Mm.
And I think maybe you were referring to maybe friends who passed away, like the aforementioned Adina, the real life Adina. But also, I think this book speaks to the ways in which we can lose friends because friends betray us, or, in high school, especially, people can be cruel. There's kind of a Mean Girls like subplot. And, I don't know. I just like to hear you talk about that, because I think it's a very common truth. And I don't hear it talked about enough, the way that losing friends can be really painful, because like as an adult, I feel like some of losing friends just has to do with getting old and getting busy and moving away and not having proximity to people, and then relationships sort of wither.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a heartbreak. And then there can be more explicit ruptures with people that can be difficult to bear. But you just talk about that, because I think it's something we all go through, but we don't discuss enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. And especially in the novel before Beautyland, Parakeet, that book was very much about family, finding family in alternate structures and friendship, especially female friendship. But I agree that that structure is so important. It can be so formative at any age, actually, and so necessary in regards to the quality of life. And my friendships have made me feel like I belong on the earth. So it wasn't a coincidence that in Beautyland, her friendships were so important, and also her family structure on earth. She's very close to a girl named Tony, who features prominently in the book, and Tony's brother Dominic. And Dominic is based on, well, he's an amalgam of boys, men in my life with whom I've shared profound affinity. And we've normally hooked up because of loving music. And especially someone I grew up with, his name is Rocco DeChico. And I
Whoa,
texted
that's a
him a
name.
few weeks. It's a great name.
Yeah.
I texted him a couple weeks ago, and I was like, just so you know, one of the characters in Beautyland, I was thinking of you when I was writing it. And he said, did you know that it was me as you were writing it, or was that something you figured out after you were done the book? And I was like, oh, that's such a good question. I'm not sure. He hasn't read it yet, but there are normally brother figures in a lot of my work, because I not only grew up with brothers, but I think my brothers kind of unlocked a certain brother shape in my life, where I was always looking for brothers in the room. Um, and I've found a lot of really good ones who've been really important to me, and Rocco is definitely one of them. But then just like friendship in general, it can just break your heart. I think you understand that romantic liaisons will end, like a
That's
breakup
right.
that has been greatly explored. There are whole industries that are exploring breakups and romantic liaisons, but the friendship breakup would fall under what could be considered disenfranchised grief, in that there isn't a whole industry and there aren't things built into society that address that kind of grief. And so you don't find as much support for it. And especially when, you're a little writer girl growing up feeling pretty strange in most situations, finding my people has been absolutely integral. And in that way, Beautyland to me is a queer book in many, many ways. Adina, Tony, and Dominic are all actually, like, literally gay, queer. Um, but also the finding of the familial structure in friends and finding chosen family is a queer lifestyle. And I was very much thinking of those things when I wrote it. And that is very, very prevalent in my life. So yeah, I think that more and more writers are putting that to the page, the kind of heartbreak that comes when you lose one of these people. Um, and if I am contributing to that, I'm glad, because I like that that's been one of my themes, because it matters to me. And I
Yeah. And
imagine it matters to you. I'm hearing that it matters to you. Yeah.
I think it matters to us all, whether we admit it or not. And I think what you said about the queer people who have chosen families, I've had that conversation on this show before. The intensity of the importance of that for people who are living in marginalized communities, it's heightened, right?
Yeah.
So the loss of a friend to somebody in that situation is maybe more painful in some
Hmm.
instances because of the critical importance of chosen family to those people and their survival.
Yeah.
And that certainly came through, and it was good to see. And it's moving, it's moving and it's relatable. And it's underdone in my view, and in a way that's not dissimilar to like writing about people who work with disabled people or writing about disabled people, period. Like that doesn't appear enough, I think, in art. It's sort of, how often do you see it in movies and television? Like
You
very
don't.
rarely.
You don't. And
So the
also, I mean, you have to be so sensitive and render it, with a lot of deft and care and homework for sure. But you're absolutely right. Like, and one thing that's great about being a fiction writer is that you get to write about all the things you wish were written about more. That's absolute. I highly recommend it. It's a great gig. It's a super great gig. But Adina comes out 3 times in the book. She tells her true identity to 3 different people and receives 3 very distinct reactions in the book. The metaphor at the heart of the equation of Beautyland is very purposeful. It's on purpose. I was thinking about these things like chosen family and what it's like to be pushed outside of society because of who you love or what you look like or what race you are, what gender you are, or what kind of things you like. And so I think Adina is very much hopefully an example of someone who is continuing to try to find her people in that kind of alternate queer and lifestyle and through chosen family.
So 2 more things.
Let's
I
do
want to
it.
talk. I want to talk to you. I always like to ask people about their career trajectory a little bit, the path that they took to getting to publication, because
Oh
it's
yeah.
heartening. It's heartening, I think, for people to hear when it's like strangely, it's heartening to hear that it was difficult, which it always is, right?
Of
It's never
course.
easy to write books and get them into print and to make a
No, it's
life
easy
doing
for
this.
some people. No, it's easy for some people.
You think? Yeah,
Oh yeah,
maybe
let's be real here, Brad. Yeah, some people have an easier time than others. But I'm
easier.
delighted to talk about this because I did not have an easy time. So I like to
Well,
talk about it for the others who are like who have nothing to do with the writing industry and feel like they cannot be writers. Those are the people I really like to talk to. So yes,
me
I would
as
be
well.
happy to talk about it.
Well, I just read that your early story collection entitled Safe as Houses, aforementioned, I don't know if we titled it, but it's the story collection we were discussing earlier,
Yeah,
was rejected 50 times. And there is a story in it called North of, which I believe features Bob Dylan. Is that the one that
that's
features
right.
Bob Dylan?
That's
So
correct.
he actually appears in your stories. That's how much you love this guy. And that
There you go.
story on an individual level was rejected 36 times. So not uncommon, like to be rejected a ton, but certainly you had to endure all of that and keep going.
Hmm.
So can you just talk about the process and how you found the strength to keep going?
Absolutely. So one tiny note though, Safest Houses, the collection wasn't rejected 50 times. The short story entitled Safest Houses was rejected,
Oh,
I think, something like
got it.
45
Got
times.
it.
In order to be totally accurate about my failures, that's yes. So, yes, Safest Houses. Well, first, I just want to say, because I think it's important to say, I grew up, I did not know any writers. I didn't know anyone who made their living as a writer. I, in Northeast Philadelphia, you were expected to get married, have a family, buy, not rent a house. And that was considered, that's the life. That's what you're supposed to do. And I didn't even know you could have a life, let alone a career in the arts. So from the very beginning, I had to kind of figure it out and discover it for myself. But like I said earlier in this interview, I've always wanted to be a writer. And so there was never going to be any life for me that didn't include writing, whether or not I ever got published. Both of my brothers were writers. It's something they showed me how to do. It just had to be writing. And so I read Edna
Wait, wait,
St.
wait, wait, wait.
Vincent.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yes.
both of your brothers are writers, so that they're like
Yeah.
professional writers.
Well, my oldest brother is a newspaper man, so he has a newspaper in Maryland, and my other brother writes, but not professionally. I think for himself, was like a poet. And so growing up, he wrote and would share poetry with me. Um,
Interesting.
and so I was reading these famous writers, and New York City was a common denominator in a lot of the works I was reading. So I was like, okay, that's where you go when you want to be a writer. So that's where I went. I'm making a very long story short, but I went to New York City, and I was in an auditorium where a very famous writer was talking, and it was my first time in a room with anyone even close to being a writer. So I was overjoyed. And that person said, only 1% of writers make a living at writing. And, everyone in the audience is like murmuring meaningfully, like, oh, oh, oh. And I was delighted because I thought I would have to invent even the possibility of that. But to hear that 1% of people were already doing it, that to me said it was possible. I was
Right.
like, oh, I didn't even realize it was possible at all. So I was someone for whom a 99% failure rate was not daunting, to a certain respect. I think that should tell you a lot right there. So the natural rejection, and I mean, I've had so many rejections, not to brag, but I've been rejected by the very best institutions in the world over and over again since the time I was 11 years old. Um, I just neutralized my fear of rejection because you just have to. And having no like connections or references, having no money, I applied to NYU and Carnegie Mellon's writing programs for college. It was my dream. And I got in, but my mom was like, there's no way we can send you to those schools. So it was just never, I never, I wasn't able to float through. I was always kind of like, you know, finding my own path or bulldozing my way through my own path, as it were. Anyway, long story short, writing stories and submitting them like it was a part-time job over and over and over again, and small successes, and just refusing to give up. Even after receiving no signals from the universe that it would ever happen, still finding my way through. And that was very much because of my fellow writers and the beloved people in my life who kept saying, keep going, keep going, keep going. There were a lot of dark nights of the soul, but I always found a way to keep going because of this voice I've always had in me that said, you're on this earth to be a writer. And the publishing was never a guarantee, but the writing was a non-negotiable. I went to Brooklyn College for my MFA because it was $3,000 a semester and I could afford to work and go at night. But I didn't do that for many years after I got an undergrad degree because I was working and because I didn't know if an MFA was even beneficial. But it was, and I got to study with geniuses like Michael Cunningham and Susan Choi. And I found my friends there. I found people there with whom, I'm still sharing work with. And I just got through. But there was just this natural resilience and moxie. But I do not mean to imply in any way that it was easy, because it wasn't. There were a lot of dark nights, and I don't know how I soldiered through. Thankfully, I have good people in my life who didn't let me quit.
And you're just stubborn, which I think is an essential
Stubborn.
quality to be
Yeah.
stubborn, right?
Well, that's working class and lower income. I mean, we were blessed with no money and we just worked. And it was instilled in me. You just work and work and work and work. And that's the answer to everything. Um, but I want to say, so people, who are maybe in the same position hear me say it, that is still not a guarantee, because you can work for so long and still not receive any acknowledgement from the industry. But I'd rather spend a day writing and failing than anything, and than spending a day any other way. And I think that it has to be that way for you to continue to keep going.
All right. So truly the last question. I always ask this of my guests. Is there anything else in the works? Are you working on another book? Is there anything we can look forward to, or are you just enjoying the publication of this one?
No, I am not only enjoying the publication. I'm working on a collection which will be out, I think this could change, in 2025. So that'll be my second collection of stories. And then after that, I'm actually working on a trilogy of books. Yeah, that should be exciting to discover and figure out.
Any hints as to what this trilogy is about, like genre-wise? Is it genre fiction, or is it literary fiction? Is it sci-fi? Is there something fantastical about it?
There is something fantastical about it, and there will be no further hints, Brad.
Okay. I respect it. It's my duty to ask, but I am always respectful of people's desire for privacy. So
Appreciate
we will
that.
we will let it end there, and people can just be on the edge of their seats waiting to see what it turns out to be. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. It's been a joy to meet you, and congratulations on Beautyland.
Thank you so much, Brad. My pleasure.